Hello, I'm your favorite host, Chelsea Toxar, and this is the Potentia Podcast, where we explore the hidden determinants of power. For today's podcast, we're going to explore some of the thoughts I'm having right now, as well as things I'm paying attention to and on my radar. Let's go. What made me interested in the concept of power? Over the course of my life, I've been interested in defense, espionage, global affairs. I've had many different lives as a journalist, so forth, so on, and I think you can be in environments where you have access to this power, or you can be in environments where you don't have access to this power. Coming from a family where half of my family is Hungarian, I heard stories growing up essentially about the difference between when the Nazis were in Hungary and when the Soviets were in Hungary, and the difference in terms of what it's like to not have power as a citizen. And what it looks like when, during the first invasion, you might get to keep your radio, and you would just have to put it in a pillow and you would sew the pillow up. But then the way that you would get around accessing the outside world and having information was you would essentially use, sticks or tools to turn the radio on through the pillow. Not very foolproof, and I don't know why they did that, but that's the story that I was told. Whereas with the second invasion by the Soviets, it was essentially they took away just all the radios. And so you were living in Hungary under occupation, having to learn Russian and essentially fall in line with the Soviet Union Communist Party. My family, that side of the family, escaped on a helicopter. I know that there are rumors that my grandfather had plans to escape to China if they weren't able to get on a helicopter out. But, there will just be certain times in conversation where my grandmother will go, oh yeah, there are times when we would be crawling on the ground, dodging the bullets, and then we got to the helicopter, and they originally wanted to come to New York, but they ended up being able to take one to Canada. So that side of the family came down to the United States through Vancouver. And learning about what it was like for my father growing up, essentially, both my grandparents had to learn English while they were here. My grandfather learned it through his fascination with mystery books and novels. And then my grandmother worked in the milk factories making powdered milk. So my father won't drink milk at all because it just gives him flashbacks to that time of acclimating and entering US society. But on the other side of my family, my mother's father, my grandfather on that side, was very steeped in mathematics and satellites. So he did work at Princeton. He would talk about Einstein and how everyone would fawn over Einstein, but then he also started a satellite company and did work with the Department of Defense. He really loved Kuwait. He loved traveling. He was the one who introduced me to the larger world. I got my fascination from the stars from him, my love for painting, for art, and also later, after I decided not to pursue engineering, my entrance in defense and intelligence, because he gave me, when I was 8 years old, a journal that was called Say It in Chinese, not a journal, a dictionary, Say It in Chinese. I still have it somewhere, and I would leaf over it as a child. I was very interested in puzzles, cryptology, mathematics, and Chinese was like a language that I had never quite seen before. I digress. You can't really learn Chinese by yourself as an 8-year-old. Anyway, so that side of the family, it was interesting because with having a company, there were stories where the family was very, very rich and then very, very poor. So both sides of my family had their own personal life challenges and struggles, divorces, so forth, so on. But anyway, when we're talking about my interest in power, it really comes from this place of the family stories that I heard on both sides, from my father's as an émigré family, and then my mother's in terms of interacting with national level and international politics and grand competition. So, like many people, I was entranced by this idea of where is our place in the world and how do we interact in systems that control us or that we live within. Life in general can be very hard. It can be tiring. So I have a lot of empathy there, but I think it's important to understand the type of systems that we plug into, that we subscribe to, that we support, our roles within them, and then understanding our position within them. So the next question there is, how can one attain power? And I think that one can do this by looking at essentially creating structures, systems, legacy models that support you. We've seen this a lot in terms of how the United States built out models across the world, financially, politically, Bretton Woods system. We see different treaties that we put into place after World War II that really benefited us, as well as investment flows and controls across the world. That's on a systemic level. It's not very sexy, but it's important. China understands this as well, so we see them pursuing this. Other countries have done this at different times, and I think it's just fascinating. But then B, we can also look at, in terms of ourselves, what is power? Power is essentially something that is born from authenticity, creativity. I do think that creativity is a human birthright. The fact that we have the agency to create and power. Of course, not always easy. You may be suppressed and within different structures, but at the end of the day, you only have control over you. So I think that's where another source of power comes from. And then C, having structures in place to facilitate increasing your power, whether plugging into different systems, different networks, and understanding strategy and using that, as well as D, influence and cultivating influence to gain more power. Who do you think is gaining power fastest from AI right now? Companies, states, individuals, or institutions? So this is an interesting question. If we're considering AI and power, I think we're at an inflection point in history where there's a lot of opportunity in terms of the barrier for accessing power, creating power by using technology has decreased. We are in the golden age of essentially, I think, before too many systems, structures, bureaucracies are up in place. So to some degree, if you have the passion, the willpower, the know-how, and the desire to create something, you can do that right now. That is the beauty of technology. With that in mind, there are more perhaps regulations or risks coming into place that we need to be aware of. B, there are compute costs that maybe weren't as, commercialized before that will be affecting this. And then C, we'll see as there's greater adoption, diffusion, and leveraging of this technology, that's going to impact power costs, so forth and so on. But in terms of, so that's a positive element. I think that we can be using AI to bypass a lot of work that maybe you weren't able to do or that you needed other people to help with. If you are building a business and you want to increase distribution, leverage, so forth, so on, you can use AI to help you with that, or you can use it for information parsing, structure building. There are so many different ways you can deploy agents, create automated systems. So that is one facet of it. But if we're talking about who is gaining power in terms of by magnet, personally, I would say that multinational companies are probably having the most power, or just companies, technology companies in general. I don't want to add any moral judgment or bias. There are certain people in the space who I'm generally wary of, just based off of the way that they treat others. But if we're just talking about power from an objective lens and standpoint, this is one reason actually why after graduating my master's degree program, originally I had intended to go into intelligence agencies and I had trained for that. I remember studying with one of my former CIA professors, and she said, I think you'd be really good for this. I really enjoy collecting information. I enjoy interacting with people, but there are just certain lifestyle choices that you have to make with that I didn't want to do at the time. So I thought, okay, what is the next thing that I can do? I'm in China at this point. I'm in Nanjing at the Johns Hopkins Nanjing Institution, and essentially I'm trying to decide what I want to do after I graduate. I had student loans that I would have to deal with. So I thought, okay, if I stay in China or if I go to Hong Kong, I'm not necessarily going to be earning USD, which will not translate over well in terms of that. I had previously worked in Washington, D.C. as an assistant and then also as a researcher for national security and intelligence. So I thought, okay, I could go to D.C. That's what many of my colleagues did, and I still have a large network there. I still go there plenty, but I wanted to try something new. And I think something that I noticed was during my time there, respectfully, sometimes I felt like I was hitting my head against the wall on issues of Iran, North Korea, China, Russia, anti-ballistic missile defense, nuclear weapons, cybersecurity, so forth, so on. I would be doing all this research and I felt like it wasn't going anywhere. And to be fair, some of these, not some, but these are large issues. And I think sometimes when you're young, you might have this ambition and excitement to change things, but you have to understand you're interacting with these systems that have been in place. And while the administration might be moving in a much more flexible way now, it wasn't always that way. So I really wanted to feel like I was having more of an impact. The speed of impact varies greatly in government and those types of bureaucratic institutions versus perhaps private business. Corporations, large companies have their own bureaucratic slowdown. If you want true speed, that's probably going to be more of a startup. But I digress. That's where I was thinking initially. My grandmother, the fifth wife of my grandfather, not my actual grandmother, but through, marriages, she was my grandmother. I learned so much from her. But she really wanted me to go to business school, which I did not, because initially I did want to go into either intelligence or foreign service. But as we can see, I did not do that. Instead, I went into first journalism, business journalism, and then I went into private sector and advising, both on terms of the policy, business, growth decision making. So across the entire spectrum, I've seen a lot of different parts of business. But when I was deciding what I wanted to do after grad school, these were parts of the things I was thinking. So then I thought, okay, where possibly could I find, where are the best locations to find these multinational companies? I had visited a friend in Seattle in between the first and second year of graduate school. Justin, go team Justin. He's married to another guy named Justin, which is actually quite funny. But I love the nature there. I'm from essentially what was a small town. Now it's completely suburbs, but we had horses growing up. I was very lucky to have complete hillsides, protected land behind the house I grew up in. I do love being somewhat near nature, but I do love being in the hustle and bustle of things. So I thought, okay, you know what, we'll give Seattle a go. It meets a lot of the different requirements in terms of A, USD, B, it has multinational companies there that are up and coming as well as well established. And then C, has pretty good access to nature. I forgot that D, I'm from California and I really enjoy sunshine. It's not everything, but that was definitely something I had to adapt to. But when I'm thinking about who's gaining power the fastest from AI right now, I say multinational companies because in many ways, while they are still beholden to sovereignty of the country with which they are operating in, there are certain ways where they can operate between countries and in some ways act as non-state actors in terms of the power that they leverage. We see this through the lobbying activities that they have, the power in that regard. I saw this in Washington. Then we also have historical case examples of this that fascinate me in terms of the merchant businessman from the 1600s to now. We have the East India Trading Company who had in fact their own military force and essentially operated in India, and also if we look at the West Indies, so forth and so on, as essentially a sovereign nation with many of the same power capabilities in place. It is also, a lot of people don't know this, but if we look at the American Revolution, while we had the Boston Tea Party, and that was kind of one famous thing that people point to, a large reason that we had the revolution of no taxation without representation was because the founding fathers and the colonies feared that there would be the same treatment in America and the United States as was done by the East India Trading Company in India. So this was a reaction and a lesson there. But I'm actually going to do a larger podcast episode on that because I think it's important to pay attention to. I think that this further compounded in terms of my opinion because while I was working on research for Amazon in its FTC trial, and it was really interesting to see how much of the market had captured, as well as the decisions that would be made in that case would influence the entire rest of the logistics supply chain as well as online e-commerce industry. So that was really interesting to look at just the amount of power wielded by one single company. And we see that today also in terms of the tech oligarchs or the techno-authoritarian class, not to moralize on anything, but they are operating in somewhat of a way that we saw perhaps in the Soviet Union when we saw companies come into power and take control versus having more democratic processes. And we see also in the crypto spaces the idea of cultivating power separate from national sovereign states. A lot of that ethos, that mentality carries over. So I think that in terms of taking it all back, who do you think is gaining power fastest from AI right now? I would say the multinational companies because they are A, leading this, the government and just governments worldwide, where there is not necessarily having a structure in place where companies are beholden to the government, as seen in China, we see a lot of the policies coming out being influenced largely by these companies, and then also the people in government not necessarily having the technical expertise to understand where to set the points or where it makes points to set these policies. A good example of this is perhaps with NVIDIA chips. We saw them set benchmarks in terms of, okay, these are going to be the export controls to ensure that China doesn't get the chips that we want for competition. But then NVIDIA would come back. It definitely, in terms of Jensen Huang, great PR strategy, much respect there, had the close ear of the president. But they would be able to adapt the chip and adjust it where it still met export controls, but then they could ship over a varied version and still continue their business. And then at a certain point, I think it was probably August, September last year, we saw them proactively design a chip and then introduce ideas proactively to the government, then rather responding before in terms of creating a sort of deal in terms of export controls and what can be done. At that point, obviously, China had been quite tired of the back and forth, and they said, okay, we're not going to pursue the dual track development at the moment. But at the same time, we do know that through back channels, that still was being done in terms of acquiring NVIDIA H200s, Blackwell, so forth, so on through Southeast Asia, other channels. And we tried closing that loophole earlier this month, so we'll see how that goes. But different conversation. So long story short, I think that multinational companies have the most power right now. Next question is, when you look at highly effective people, what traits do you think actually compound over time? What goes into this? There are a few big points. One is discipline, 2 is strategy, and then 3 is belief, vision, or curiosity. Let's start with strategy. I think you have to first break down what you want to achieve in order to reverse engineer how to get there. I think that generally speaking, most people can achieve whatever they want to. They can learn almost anything that they want to. You can be anything you want to be if you have the willpower and the discipline to apply it, as well as the strategy to pursue it. There are certain ways where you can do it faster than others, and I think that is one place wherein value lies, is A, reducing pain points, and B, getting people what they want faster. A good example of this was I was never fat, but I have a twin. And growing up, she was the quote-unquote slender one, and I was just the kid where I was running around outside. I was a bit of a tomboy. But I think something to note from that was when I reached high school, I started to become more aware of how I looked. I appreciate that I was never pressured growing up about that, but I wanted to lose weight. I wanted to be attractive. I wanted to be healthy. And the way I went about it initially wasn't very healthy. So essentially, first, I remember my first approach was to start just by cutting my meals in half. I just decided one day I'm going to cut my meals in half. And then if I ate too much, I remember my quote-unquote punishment would be I'd have to go for a run. So say it's 95 degrees heat in California, I ate too much for lunch, and so I would train myself essentially not to do that by going for a run afterward and being in immense discomfort. Not the most healthy way to do it. I also learned to count calories. If you give me a piece of food or something, I also love to cook, I can probably break down how many calories is going to be in that. Give me a banana, egg, this, that. I can tell you how many calories. And I became obsessed with weight and numbers. But then eventually, I became much more quote unquote slender or lean in terms of what was the beauty standard at the time. So when I went into college, I started to experiment more with my looks, health, fitness. I was going to the gym every day. I still work out quite regularly. I strength train 3 to 4 times a week and do cardio, dance, stretch, yoga. Other days of the week, I'm a certified hatha yoga instructor. I got certified in Budapest. But movement is an important part of life. At the same time, I don't think you need to be torturing yourself, and there are healthy ways to do it depending what your goals are. I make sure I have enough energy to do what I want, essentially in terms of weightlifting or sports and activities. But that did take a lot of strategy in terms of learning what is the way that I can do this in terms of achieving it. But then also, what is the impact to my mental and emotional health in doing that? And then see, am I happy with the final result of how I look and how I feel? And you have to have a strategy in terms of understanding the end goal of what you want to achieve, and then you can reverse engineer there for what fits your lifestyle. So I think that if you have a strategy or goals, it helps immensely, because once you know what you want, you can break down from there, and you can also adjust the different components of how you want your life to look, which takes us to B, discipline. I think that discipline is probably one of the biggest things that people can have in their life, because your feelings are like clouds. It's not that they're not important, but you don't need to attach meaning to every single one of them, and you don't need to accept every thought or feeling as true. It could just be a system response that you have, or a reaction that you have to something. It is your body's warning sign or a mechanism, and then it's an invitation for you to see, how does this make me feel? Do I want to be listening to it? Do I want to adjust my perspective? So forth, so on. But if you're falling prey to your feelings, say you're tired, you had a bad day, you don't really feel like going to the gym. If you fall into a habit of not doing that, you're not going to be reaching your goal. If you don't do your work, you're not going to get paid. So sometimes you have to put aside how you feel and understand that I'm okay experiencing a bit discomfort, but also I don't need to claim this feeling. I can just understand it's temporal. And I think that makes it a bit easier to have discipline in terms of deciding what you want. I think the other thing is by focusing on what you will have. So you can be either motivated by a carrot or a stick. So in terms of pain point of, what is the cost of not having discipline? Will I be stuck where I am now? Do I like this? No. So then we can also look at it, what will I gain? And people will have different degree of motivation in terms of if they prefer carrot or stick. But if you focus on what you're gaining or what you're introducing new into your life, instead of not, oh, I have to go to the gym, it's, oh, I get to have this nice outfit, or oh, I get to have a community there, so forth, so on, or I get to enjoy the endorphin rush and oxytocin in my body. So you can focus on the positive outcome as well. But discipline and willpower is ultimately what's going to be able to get you to what you want, because we are human, we are not machines. You can't expect yourself to be 100% all the time. You can give yourself grace, but discipline is what's going to get you from A to B, 0 to 1. And then the last point is belief, a vision. If you are lacking either of these things, you don't really have anything to work towards. If you don't have a vision, a goal, or belief in yourself, you are first the only person who you will be with your entire life. So it's a lot better to be your own best friend than your own worst enemy. And then the other thing is having a decision or a vision. By deciding, Latin decide is to cut off all other options. And you can always change your mind, but unless you decide, unless you hold clear in your mind the vision of what you want, you're not necessarily going to bring change into the world, because you don't know what you're working towards. You're going to be floundering along aimlessly. A nice name has a quote. Let me look it up really quick. You read her diaries and journals, she has a lot of profound insights. Her quote is, "Had I not created my own world, I certainly would have died in other people's." And I think this is a very poignant lesson that we can take away. And this traces back to when we think of power in systems, whether we're talking about AI, whether we're talking about art, technology, film, just the day-to-day living, or even the smaller structures of family dynamics or social dynamics. You don't always need to be fighting, but you need to understand what is your guiding compass, because you are responsible for your own world and you're the only one that has the power to create what you want. I think that a lot of times we'll hear of people having regrets in terms of dreams not pursued, or things at the end of their life where they would have done something differently. And you don't need to be perfect, but if you are pursuing a world in the vision that you created, the way you experience the world is through your perspective. That's your entire life. So if you don't create your own world, you will inherently be living in other people's. People say, oh, be the main character, this and that. But I think you don't have to be so serious, of course, but you don't want to be flippant about it either. And you don't always have to please everyone. But if you are bringing some type of satisfaction to yourself in your own journey and curiosity, I think that's going to be a life well lived. How do I cultivate my own sense of agency when the world feels noisy, unstable, or shaped by forces much larger than one person? I'll just answer this one more shortly. Again, I think of a vision of how do I want my day-to-day to look? What would I like to experience? What would I like to explore? I try to approach it more from curiosity than fear. And then if I ever feel overwhelmed or fatigued, I either reconnect with art, film, music, and I'm much more mindful of the type of art and film that I engage with, and music, anything. That's a different question in terms of the mental diet. I do think mental diet is as important as physical diet. I think that when you reconnect with art and these feelings of beauty, it gives you a sense of something that connects all of us, and it can be quite nourishing. Get outside, get some fresh air. I think that some of my favorite memories are when I do my meditations. I like to do that in terms of it's just a good way to check in with myself in the morning or at night before I go to sleep or before I get out of bed. It's a way to set a vision for the day, how I expect it to go. But when I am entering this space, essentially, of the vision that I have for myself, what I want to give to the world, I will generally create a more positive energy is by bringing back memories of sheer beauty, of when I felt inspired, beautiful, even though I felt small. I have a memory from when I was in Siberia in Russia. I was in Irkutsk. It's more of a lawless country out there in terms of the regulations, but I'm essentially in this snow tundra. It's just empty for miles. Just came out of a forest of trees into a clearing of snow, and the snow is falling, glistening, covering the tracks from where I just was. So I think of that beautiful glistening moment, and even though I wasn't necessarily the focal point or the center of it, I just got to witness and experience immense beauty with the cold on my skin, the slight bite where it just makes you feel alive. I think it's very easy, especially right now, in terms of humans weren't necessarily designed in terms of our biological systems to interact with technology at the scale with which we do. So I think it's good to understand to be gentle with that. And again, you can sheer willpower through things, but depending on your experience of your health and your desire for the world, I'm quite ambitious. So I'm working all the time in mind and imagining all these things and thinking about things in depth, but I enjoy it. And if it ever becomes too overwhelming or noisy, those are ways that I will take a step back and nourish and reconnect with myself and my larger purpose. I had another interview on here with Nick Vyas, and we have very similar minds in terms of cultivating and giving back to the world and having a larger purpose, because that is something that will sustain you beyond more shallow things. Where do you think productivity advice gets human nature wrong? And what have I learned? I think, again, you can always have a plan, you can have a to-do list of things you want to do, but at the foremost of everything is health. So I think you need to habit stack in order to support your health, not just for today, tomorrow, but for the longevity of yourself. If you don't have your health, you don't have anything. I've had times when I've been desperately ill, I've been bedridden, and it's not fun. I've also seen from working with elderly people in yoga, as well as just interacting with elderly, many times, unless it's that part of your life, it's very natural. But unless you take precautions to protect your body, you will suffer, because you won't have necessarily the muscles to compensate for certain movements or things that you do day to day. So you really need to protect your health. And the ways you can go about this are regular movement, strength training, having some type of flexibility, mobility. I would say mobility is the key word. So mobility, strength training, sleep is critical. I think the other thing about human nature is I don't really attach too much judgment for things unless you're actively suppressing or hurting people. But whatever permission slip helps you achieve what you want or works for you, whether that's prayer, meditation, some type of religion. I think that they're all important to cultivate, because I don't think we are just physical beings. I do think there's a little bit more. I don't need to understand all of it, but that's just been my experience. Then lastly, what are you paying closest attention to right now in your own life in terms of what's on my radar, what I'm paying attention to? Besides the conversations around power, geopolitics, AI, policy in the world, business, growth in terms of the day-to-day work. I'm thinking about one of my friends who's down in Los Angeles. He's creating a script for a film called Rom-Con. A lot of his work explores the early age of the internet, when we had chat rooms and the ability to connect with people online and have really deep, meaningful relationships with maybe someone that you've never met in person or even saw online. The idea of, oh, you could log onto a game online and then one day you'll have a conversation with them and that will be the last time you ever speak to this person with whom you got really close because you don't know them in real life. And the idea of rom-con is essentially entering a chat room and you fall in love, and then what does that look like having a romance online? But then it turns out it's a con, and I think it's going to be a fun type of romantic comedy. So that's something that I've been thinking about in terms of not just the connections that we can have, but also the potentially darker, more devious sides of the internet in terms of con artists and different actors misrepresenting themselves, which I think is not just interesting in terms of the early days of the internet, but timely now because it's just a tale as old as time in terms of human interests of deception and love. So I think it's going to be very interesting to explore. I'm still on my manhwa isekai kick, so there's that. I think just two last things before I go that I'm paying attention to. One, the idea of creating a power profile series. I'm really interested in the different factions, the figures, the people that we have in power and what we can learn from them. I really enjoyed the Acquired podcast, and that really looks at companies and power kind of stories there. So I think a series that I'll be creating is one looking at figures in power, powerful people. So that's going to be like Jack Ma, Elon Musk, Sam Altman. We'll even look at historical figures, maybe Napoleon, so forth, so on. If you have any people you want me to explore, let me know, but that's one thing that's on my radar. And then the second thing I think that I'm really focused on right now is the East India Trading Company and examples of multinational non-state actors, predominantly companies, and how they wield their power. So I think that will be another series as well. And we'll kick it off with the East India Trading Company. Yes, I'll add links of these things that you can add to your queue, that you can explore. That's it for this time in terms of the On My Radar Dispatch series. Make sure to tune in for more episodes as we kick off these series on power profiles, non-state actors, interviews, and other weekly podcast series we have going on. Again, thank you for your kind support, your kind words. Every like, follow, share means the world to us. And I'm just so glad that we can have these conversations. I'm your favorite host, Chelsea Talksar. Make sure to tune in for more next time at the Potentia Podcast. See you soon.